He stood at the altar, smiled at his bride, and said, "I do." But he already knew everything. Every single thing. His best man stood right beside him. The same man who'd been destroying him behind his back for over a year. 3 days before the wedding, he'd heard a voicemail that shattered his entire world. And he didn't cancel a single thing. Because the revenge he planned? It didn't happen in private. It happened in front of every single person they both loved. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Hazel. Grab your coffee. Actually, grab something stronger. Because today's story is absolutely unhinged in the best possible way. If you're new here, hit subscribe right now. We talk about revenge, drama, and people finally getting exactly what they deserve. You're going to want to stay? Let me introduce you to our protagonist. His name is Callum. 29 years old, an architectural engineer, genuinely kind human being. Callum was the guy who remembered your birthday, helped you move apartments, and never, ever asked for anything in return. He'd been with his fiancée, Renata, for 4 years. Met her at a mutual friend's rooftop party. He called it the best night of his life. Renata was charming, sharp-tongued in a witty way, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately owned it. They looked perfect together, travelled together, talked about kids, houses, growing old on a porch somewhere quiet. Callum proposed after 3 years. Custom ring he'd saved for quietly. She said yes before he even finished the sentence. Now let's talk about Dorian, Callum's best man. They'd been friends since they were 11 years old. 18 years of brotherhood. Dorian was the best man at his older brother's wedding. He was the first call Callum made when his grandfather passed away. On the surface, Dorian was electric. Funny, magnetic, the life of every single party. Everyone loved him, including Callum's entire family. Here's a critical detail. Callum's father, a man named Gerard, owned a mid-sized construction firm. Dorian had worked there for 6 years. Gerard had practically mentored Dorian, promoted him twice, treated him like a second son, trusted him completely with sensitive client accounts. The wedding planning began. Renata took the lead, obsessively so. Callum thought it was just excitement. He was so beautifully wrong. Looking back, the signs were absolutely there. Renata would step outside to take calls. She'd close her laptop when he walked by. But Callum trusted her. That's what love does, right? It makes you assume the best. It makes you blind to what's right in front of you. Dorian was deeply involved in wedding planning too. He's basically co-hosting, Renata had joked once. Callum thought that was sweet. There was one evening, Callum mentioned it later, where he walked in and Renata was laughing at her phone. She flipped it over instantly. He asked who it was. She said it was her cousin Bettina being ridiculous. He believed her. He always believed her. 3 weeks before the wedding, the bachelor party. Callum, Dorian, and 6 other guys. A cabin weekend. His words, one of the best trips of my life. Dorian gave a toast that night, called Callum the most loyal man I've ever known. The whole group cheered. Callum was genuinely moved. While the boys were at the cabin, Renata and Dorian were texting constantly. We know this because of what happened 3 days later. Callum came home Sunday night. Renata was out with her bridal party. The apartment was quiet. He sat down to decompress, and then he noticed it. Dorian had left his phone behind, probably fell out of his bag during the pre-party hangout earlier that day. The phone buzzed. A voicemail notification lit up the screen. Callum glanced over. His eyes caught the name in the preview. The preview showed 3 words of a text that accompanied it. 3 words that made his entire body go completely, terrifyingly still. He picked up the phone. He tells this story now and says his hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped it twice. He pressed play, and what he heard, in full audio, loud and crystal clear, rearranged every single thing he understood about his life. It was Renata's voice first, then Dorian's. They were laughing. That particular kind of laugh that only exists between 2 people sharing something deeply private. Renata said, and these are his words, "He genuinely has absolutely no idea, does he?" Dorian laughed and said, "Not even close." They were talking about Callum. The man planning to marry her in 3 days. The man whose best friend was standing in his wedding. Callum sat in that quiet apartment for 2 hours. He didn't move. He didn't call anyone. He just sat there and let the truth settle in. And then, and this is the part that makes this story legendary, he didn't pick up his phone to call off the wedding. He wiped his face. He made himself a drink. He sat back down, and he started to think, calmly, methodically, precisely. He transferred the voicemail to his own phone. He saved multiple copies. He called no one. He told no one. He just planned. 3 days. He had 3 days to either blow everything up publicly or do something far, far more elegant. Callum chose elegant. He decided the betrayal deserved a public stage, a real one, with everyone who mattered sitting in attendance. The venue was already booked. A gorgeous old estate ballroom, 220 guests, a 14-piece band, an open bar. For 3 days, Callum performed. He kissed Renata good morning. He answered Dorian's texts. He acted like everything was absolutely perfect. Renata was glowing, completely oblivious, talking about honeymoon reservations, talking about which photos she wanted framed in the hallway. Dorian was his usual self, cracking jokes at the rehearsal dinner, giving Callum a side hug, completely comfortable, completely confident. At the rehearsal dinner, Dorian gave a preview of his toast. "I've been working on something really special," he told the table. "Oh, we know." Callum smiled and said he couldn't wait to hear it. And he meant that. Just not in the way Dorian understood. Wedding morning arrived. Callum woke up early. He showered, put on his suit, and sat quietly with a cup of coffee for 20 minutes. He stared at his reflection. Later he described that moment as, "I've never felt more clear-headed in my entire life. I was ready." Dorian arrived at the hotel suite with the other groomsmen, laughing, hyped, playing music, completely catastrophically unaware. The ceremony was beautiful. 220 people dressed in their finest. The venue was genuinely stunning. Everything looked perfect. Renata walked down the aisle in a dress she'd spent 4 months obsessing over. She was genuinely beautiful, and she was genuinely awful. Several guests cried. Some later said Callum looked more emotional than they expected. They were right, just not for the reason they assumed. They exchanged vows. Callum delivered his calmly, clearly, without a single crack in his voice. An Oscar-worthy performance, genuinely. When the officiant said, "You may now kiss the bride," Callum kissed her. He says now that's the moment he felt the plan truly lock into place. They were announced as husband and wife. The room erupted. Champagne was poured. The band played. Everything was spectacular. Dinner was served. Toasts began. Family members went first. Sweet, sentimental, the usual. Callum was warm and gracious to everyone. Then Dorian stood up, buttoned his jacket, picked up the microphone with that easy, confident smile he always carried everywhere. 220 people turned toward him, glasses raised, smiles ready. The room was completely warm and completely unsuspecting. Dorian started his toast, told a funny story from their college years, got a big laugh. He was in his element, completely at ease. And then Callum stood up, quietly, calmly. He held up one hand and said, "Sorry to jump in, Dorian. I actually want to add something first." A few people laughed, assuming it was a bit. Renata tilted her head slightly. Dorian smiled and stepped back, gesturing like a gentleman. Callum thanked everyone for coming, said how much the day meant to him. His voice was steady, warm, completely in control. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and he pressed play. The voicemail played through the venue's speakers, because yes, he'd arranged that in advance with the sound technician. Every single word. Renata's voice filled the room, then Dorian's, then laughter, then those words. He has absolutely no idea, does he? 220 people went absolutely silent. The kind of silence that has physical weight. You could hear the candles flickering. Renata stood up. Her face had gone completely white. She said his name once. Just once. He didn't look at her. Dorian didn't move. He stood there with the champagne glass still in his hand, and a smile that had completely died on his face. Callum set the microphone down on the table. Gently. No drama, no yelling. He straightened his jacket and walked toward the exit. At the door, he paused, turned around once, looked at the entire room, then he walked out without saying another single word. The room erupted. 220 people talking at once, half of them looking at Renata, half looking at Dorian. Nobody knew what to do. Callum's mother was the first to stand. His sister followed. His father, Gerard, sat completely still. We'll come back to Gerard in a moment. Renata reportedly broke down in tears immediately. Members of her bridal party rushed to her. But the damage was done. Permanently. Dorian was surrounded by people demanding explanations. He tried to speak. Nobody was interested in a single word coming out of his mouth. Callum, meanwhile, had already arranged a car. He went to a hotel, called his 2 closest non-wedding friends, ordered room service, breathed. He said that night was the first time in 3 days he felt genuinely at peace. The weight had been carried. The truth had been delivered. The next morning, he was on the phone with his lawyer. An annulment was filed within 48 hours on the grounds of fraud and deception. Because they'd technically been married for fewer than 72 hours and the grounds were clear, the annulment moved forward with remarkable speed. And then there's Gerard, Callum's father, who had employed Dorian for 6 years, who had mentored him, promoted him, trusted him deeply. Gerard called Dorian into his office Monday morning. He didn't yell, he didn't lecture, he simply placed a termination letter on the desk. Dorian was walked out of the building the same day. 6 years, 2 promotions, gone. And his professional references? Completely worthless overnight. The construction industry in their city is tight-knit. Word travelled. Other firms started asking questions. Dorian's job search became considerably more complicated. Renata found herself completely isolated. Her friends were split, and many of the mutual ones chose Callum without any hesitation whatsoever. The wedding photos that guests had already posted online were screenshotted and shared. The story spread far beyond their immediate social circle. The venue was cleaned up the next day, the flowers were thrown out, the cake was still mostly uncut. A very expensive metaphor. Callum emerged from this with his dignity completely intact. His community rallied around him. His family was furious on his behalf, but proud of him. He took 2 weeks off work, traveled solo to somewhere coastal, said it was the most restorative trip of his life. He came back grounded, clear. No public statements, no social media drama, just a man who had handled something catastrophic with remarkable class. Okay, AY, I need a moment, because the layers of this plan, the patience, the surgical precision. Callum is not human, he is architecture. Let's slow down and actually unpack everything that happened here, because this story is a masterclass on multiple levels simultaneously. First, the decision not to cancel the wedding. That is the key choice, the pivot point, and it requires a specific kind of mind to make it. Most people, and I say this without judgment, would have exploded the second they heard that voicemail, called Renata immediately, called Dorian, lost it. And if he had, Renata would have cried. Dorian would have apologized. It would have been a messy, private, controllable crisis for both of them. They could have spun the narrative. He overreacted. It was complicated. It wasn't what it seemed. You know exactly how that goes. But by choosing the public stage? Callum removed every single exit. There was no narrative to spin. There was no private conversation to twist. 220 witnesses heard the same audio at the same exact moment. You cannot gaslight 220 people simultaneously. The voicemail was the evidence. The guests were the jury. The reception was the trial. And Callum was the world's most composed prosecutor. Notice also what he did not do. He didn't yell. He didn't curse. He didn't make accusations. He simply pressed play. He let them condemn themselves. That's critical. The most powerful condemnation always comes from the villain's own words. Callum understood that intuitively and weaponized it perfectly. And then he walked out. No dramatic speech, no final insult, no tears, just the mic on the table and his back to the room. Absolutely cinematic. Honestly, if this were a movie, that walk to the door would be scored with something hauntingly quiet, because silence hits harder than music sometimes. Now let's talk about Renata, because her psychology in this story is genuinely fascinating and deeply worth examining closely. She was with Callum for 4 years. She agreed to marry him. She planned a wedding. She stood at that altar knowing what she'd been doing. That is not a moment of weakness. That is not a mistake. That is a sustained, deliberate, year-long performance. That takes effort. Dark effort. Renata had completely compartmentalized her life. Callum existed in one box. Dorian existed in another, and she moved between them without apparent distress. Psychologists call this a particular pattern of compartmentalized narcissism, where the person genuinely believes they deserve both lives simultaneously. There's an underlying belief system at work. I deserve the stability Callum provides and the excitement Dorian offers. Why should I have to choose? People who love narcissists describe a specific phenomenon. The relationship feels almost too good. The partner performs affection masterfully. Callum described Renata as incredibly loving, attentive, the kind of partner who made you feel chosen. That's not an accident, it's a skill. For a compartmentalizing narcissist, maintaining the, quote, good partner performance isn't just cover, it's also a source of ego supply, being desired from multiple directions simultaneously. And that voicemail laugh, he has absolutely no idea. That's the most revealing detail of the entire story. That's not guilt, that's sport. Contempt, that's what that laugh is. The total absence of empathy for the person you're supposed to love most. That is genuinely chilling behavior. And the fact that Dorian shared in that laugh? That's its own category of betrayal. He wasn't just having an affair. He was enjoying the deception. Think about that bachelor cabin trip. Dorian toasting to Callum being the most loyal man he'd ever known, while actively betraying him. Unfathomable. There are people who experience a specific kind of thrill from getting away with something. The secret itself becomes addictive. The risk amplifies the excitement. For Dorian and Renata, being close to Callum, attending his events, his family dinners, his bachelor party, wasn't a burden. It was part of the game. That's genuinely one of the most disturbing aspects of this story. The proximity to Callum wasn't accidental. It was the point. The danger was the attraction. I want to take a second, because I genuinely feel second-hand rage on Callum's behalf every single time I think about that toast at the rehearsal dinner. Dorian stood at a rehearsal dinner and gave a preview of his best man speech about loyalty, about friendship, while the betrayal was actively ongoing. And Callum sat there, knowing everything, watching Dorian perform warmth and brotherhood, and didn't flinch. That's a level of self-control I genuinely cannot fathom. Most of us would have flipped the table. Most of us would have cracked. Callum just smiled, thanked him, and filed it all away. Let's talk about the practical genius of the plan itself, because the logistics here deserve serious appreciation and analysis. First, Callum saved multiple copies of that voicemail immediately. He wasn't reactive. He was methodical. He secured his evidence before anything else. Second, he pre-arranged with the sound technician to patch his phone audio through the venue's speaker system. He planned the production of his revelation. That means that at some point during the lead-up to the wedding, Callum had a quiet conversation with a venue staff member, while appearing completely normal to everyone else. For 3 days, he carried this enormous weight, while simultaneously being a loving fiancé, a cheerful groom, a grateful guest at his own rehearsal dinner. 3 days. I want to ask you something. Could you do that? Could you sit across from someone who broke your heart and smile at them for 72 hours? Because most people can't. Most people need to confront immediately. The discomfort of knowing while pretending is almost physically intolerable for most. But Callum understood something important. The short-term pain of those 3 days was the price of a far more complete and lasting justice. He was playing the long game. Not the long game of months, the long game of 72 hours. And it was absolutely worth every single minute. Now let's talk about Gerard's role, because the professional consequence for Dorian is the second layer of this revenge, and it's devastatingly effective. Gerard hadn't just given Dorian a job, he'd given him opportunity, promotion, mentorship, and the kind of professional trust that takes years to build. He'd treated Dorian like a second son, brought him into the inner circle of a family business. That's an enormous gesture of genuine human trust. And Dorian had repaid that trust by spending a year systematically betraying Gerard's actual son. There's a specific word for that kind of person, several actually. Gerard's decision to terminate was clean, immediate, and completely justified. He didn't humiliate Dorian publicly at the firing. He simply removed him, surgically. But the professional fallout extended far beyond that one termination. Industry networks talk. Mutual professional contacts connect. The why becomes known quickly. Dorian had been positioned, through Gerard's mentorship, at a fairly senior level. Walking away with a termination of that nature, in a tight industry, is genuinely costly. He didn't lose a job, he lost a career trajectory. He lost a professional reputation. He lost 6 years of carefully built positioning. In one Monday morning meeting, Renata's social consequences were equally significant. The mutual friend group, the wedding guests, the family connections, all of those relationships were permanently altered. People who witnessed that reception don't forget what they heard. Every mutual gathering, every future event, every common space, it's there, permanently, unavoidably. And the annulment, completed within a week, meant that legally, this marriage was treated as though it never existed, which is about as complete a rejection as the law allows. Renata didn't get to be a divorced woman with a complicated story. She was annulled. The marriage was declared void, based on fraud. That's her legal legacy of this situation. And let me talk about something I think gets overlooked in stories like this. And that's what Callum actually lost here. Because he did lose things, real things. He lost 4 years of genuine investment, real memories, a future he'd actually imagined in detail, the house, the kids, the porch. That was real to him. He lost his best friend of 18 years. That's not a small thing. Dorian had been present for the defining moments of Callum's adult life. When you lose an 18-year friendship to betrayal, you're not just losing the person, you're losing your memory of who you thought they were. That's a specific grief. That solo coastal trip Callum took? I think that's where he processed both losses simultaneously, Renata and Dorian, 2 people, one enormous hole in his life. The revenge was satisfying, the justice was clean, but healing from this kind of layered betrayal, that's the actual long game, and it takes genuine time. What I deeply respect about Callum is that by all accounts, he did the healing work. He didn't spiral publicly, he didn't obsess, he processed and moved forward. There are specific lessons in this story that I think are worth naming clearly, because they apply to so many situations beyond just relationship betrayal. Lesson 1. Your instincts are usually right. Every minor red flag Callum described, the flipped phone, the stepped outside calls, those were real signals. They were just filed away. We often override our intuition with the story we want to be true. The "she's just talking to her cousin" explanation. The explanation that requires less pain. But the nervous system knows before the conscious mind accepts. That slight unease when she flipped the phone, that was real information. It was just unwelcome. Lesson 2. The space between discovery and response is where your power lives. Callum didn't react. He responded, 3 days later, on his terms, in his timing. Most of the time, when we react immediately to a betrayal, we give the other person the advantage. They get to see our wound. They get to manage us. But when you pause, when you plan, you take complete control of the story. You decide the time, the audience, the medium. The power shifts entirely. Lesson 3. The venue matters. Callum understood intuitively that the same truth delivered in a private argument versus a public room lands completely differently. In private, Renata and Dorian could have cried, apologized, minimized, gaslit. With 220 witnesses, none of those tools were available to them. There's something about public accountability that removes the fog of private emotional manipulation. When others are watching, the masks come off. completely and immediately. Lesson 4. Your dignity is the most valuable asset you own. Callum walked out of that room with his completely intact. No screaming, no breakdown, no begging. He was the wronged party who never once acted like a victim. He acted like a man who knew his own worth and refused to perform grief for people who didn't deserve it. Lesson 5. Betrayal reveals character, both the betrayers and the betrayeds. We see Renata and Dorian clearly now, but we also see Callum clearly, and he's remarkable. Anyone can be gracious when life is easy. The real measure of a person is who they become when they're blindsided by the worst kind of pain. I keep coming back to one image from this story. Callum, alone in that apartment, sitting in complete silence for 2 hours after hearing the voicemail. That silence is where the entire story was decided. Everything that followed, the plan, the execution, the walkout, it all grew from that 2 hours of quiet. He could have let rage lead. He chose clarity instead. And that single choice changed every single outcome that followed. Rage is loud and immediate and ultimately powerless. Clarity is quiet and patient and absolutely devastating. Callum chose devastation, the elegant kind. And Renata and Dorian. They now live with the knowledge that their cruelty, captured in their own voices, delivered at their own celebration, ended everything. That recording doesn't go away. The guests at that wedding don't forget what they heard. The professional fallout doesn't quietly reverse itself. Permanent. All of it. And maybe the most important thing, Callum didn't have to do a single dishonest thing to achieve this outcome. He just played back their own truth. At maximum volume. Somewhere, there's still a vendor invoice for 220 guests at an estate ballroom. Someone paid for a wedding that became the most legendary breakup in their social circle's history. I genuinely hope the catering was worth it. I genuinely hope that 14-piece band played something absolutely beautiful while the entire situation collapsed in real time. Okay, I'm sorry, but imagine being the band. Imagine just trying to play your set list while the entire reception descends into stunned chaos around you. Absolute scenes. But on a genuinely serious note, this story is ultimately about something really important. It's about what happens when you refuse to be diminished by people who decided you were disposable. Callum refused to be the guy who was quietly discarded, who found out after the wedding, who spent years wondering if there were signs. He took his moment, and he walked away from that moment as the author of his own story, not a supporting character in someone else's deception, the architect of his own outcome. Now, I genuinely need to know what you think. Drop it in the comments right now. Was Callum absolutely right to wait and do it publicly, or would you have handled it differently? And here's the harder question. Could you have maintained that composure for 3 days? Be honest, because I genuinely don't know if I could. I want to know about you. If this story had you gripping your coffee cup, subscribe right now. New stories every week. I'm Hazel. I'll see you in the next one. Don't let anyone make you a side character in your own life. Ever.